My mother's crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the marble floor of their Willowbrook estate when I handed her the property deed with my name as the new owner. "You bought our house," she whispered, her face draining of all color as my father sat frozen in his leather armchair, the evening newspaper crumpling in his grip. "Not bought," I said calmly, adjusting my Cartier watch while surveying the familiar living room where I'd once been told I was throwing my life away. "I purchased it outright. Cash offer. 30% above asking price." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The silence that followed was more deafening than any argument we'd ever had. This was the same living room where, just 5 years earlier, they had sat me down after my college graduation and delivered the crushing verdict that would change everything between us forever. "Amelia, we need to be honest with you," my father, Robert Hartwell, had said in that same condescending tone he reserved for discussing my poor life choices. "Your degree in digital arts and media technology was a complete waste of our money. $60,000 down the drain for what? So you can play with computers and make little videos?" My mother, Patricia Hartwell, had nodded in agreement from her perch on the very same velvet sofa where she now sat speechless, watching their daughter, the one they'd written off as a failure, casually explain how she'd just acquired their dream retirement home in the exclusive Willowbrook Hills community. "We should have insisted you study something practical," she had continued that day 5 years ago, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Medicine, law, business. Something with a real future. Instead, you chose this hobby degree that's left you living in that tiny apartment, working at that ridiculous startup company no one's ever heard of." But tonight, as I stood in their $1.2 million living room holding the deed that proved I now owned every square inch of their precious estate, including the imported Italian tiles beneath their feet and the custom chandelier hanging over their heads, the tables had turned in the most spectacular way imaginable. "The moving company will be here next Tuesday," I continued, my voice steady and professional as I pulled out my phone to show them the calendar reminder. "I've arranged for a full-service relocation team to help you pack. They're quite efficient, everything will be handled with care." My father finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "This has to be some kind of mistake, Amelia. How could you possibly afford? I mean, your job at that little tech company." He trailed off, his eyes darting around the room as if seeing it for the first time, suddenly realizing that his daughter, the one he'd dismissed as an underachiever, was now his landlord. "Oh, you mean Cloud Vision Interactive?" I smiled, enjoying every second of his confusion. "The little tech company that just went public last month? The one where I serve as Chief Technology Officer and hold a 15% equity stake?" I paused, letting that information sink in while watching my mother's hand fly to her throat in shock. "The same company that's now valued at $800 million after our IPO? That little tech company?" The newspaper finally fell from my father's hands entirely, landing with a soft thud on the Persian rug they'd been so proud to show off to their country club friends. This was the same rug where I'd sat cross-legged as a 22-year-old college graduate, listening to them explain why my career choice was impractical and unrealistic and how I'd never amount to anything in that field. "But that's impossible," my mother stammered, finally finding her voice. You were working with those computers and those games and those silly apps. That's not a real career. That's not how people make serious money." I pulled out my latest bank statement and set it gently on their mahogany coffee table, the same table where they'd once spread out brochures for practical graduate programs they wanted me to consider. "My quarterly dividend payment alone was enough to buy this house outright," I explained patiently, as if speaking to children who couldn't quite grasp a simple concept. "The signing bonus from my CTO position? That covered the furniture. The patent royalties from the 3 revolutionary algorithms I developed during my worthless education? Well, those pay for my monthly expenses. Before we dive deeper into how we got to this moment of perfect vindication, tell me in the comments, have you ever had family members doubt your dreams? And if this story of ultimate family justice is hitting home for you, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because tomorrow I'm sharing an even more incredible story about a teacher who told her student he'd never amount to anything. You won't believe what happened when he became her boss. The look of absolute bewilderment on both their faces was worth every sleepless night I'd spent building my career, every doubt-filled moment when their voices echoed in my head telling me I was making a mistake, every time I'd questioned whether they might be right about my chosen path. But this moment of sweet vindication was just the beginning of a story that started 5 years ago with crushing disappointment and led to the most satisfying reversal of fortune imaginable. My mother finally managed to stand up, her legs visibly shaking as she surveyed the room that was no longer hers. "I don't understand how this happened," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "We were so sure you were throwing your life away." "I know you were," I replied softly, my voice carrying none of the anger or resentment they might have expected. "But sometimes the biggest waste isn't the money spent on education, it's the failure to recognize potential when it's sitting right in front of you." As I watched my parents grapple with this new reality, I couldn't help but smile at the beautiful irony of it all. The daughter they'd written off as a financial disappointment had just become their new landlord, and the education they considered worthless had generated enough wealth to make their most ambitious dreams look modest by comparison. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That moment of perfect justice still gives me chills whenever I think about it. The way my father's confident businessman facade completely crumbled as he stared at the legal documents proving his failure of a daughter now owned his crown jewel property. The sound of my mother's wine glass hitting the marble floor seemed to echo through the entire house, punctuating the end of one chapter of our relationship and the beginning of something completely different. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To truly understand the sweetness of watching them realize that their worthless investment in my education had actually created the very wealth that now controlled their future, you need to know how deeply their rejection had cut, and how impossible my success must have seemed from where we started. The shocked expression on my father's face as he processed the fact that his daughter, the one he'd publicly called an expensive mistake at family gatherings, was now in a position to make decisions about his living situation was absolutely priceless. The way my mother kept looking around their beloved Willowbrook estate as if seeing it for the first time, suddenly understanding that every custom detail they'd carefully selected was now mine to decide upon. This wasn't just about buying a house. This was about the complete reversal of every assumption they'd made about success, about practical choices, about what constitutes a real career. For 5 years, they'd treated me like a cautionary tale they'd share with their friends at the Willowbrook Country Club. "Don't let your children make Amelia's mistakes," my mother would warn other parents over wine and appetizers. All that money on a computer degree, and look where it got her. Well, now they knew exactly where it got me. It got me enough financial power to literally own the roof over their heads. But to understand why that moment felt like the universe finally setting things right, you need to understand the journey that brought us to this point. You need to know about the years of doubt, the constant criticism, the way they made me question everything I thought I knew about my own potential. You need to know about the girl who walked across the graduation stage 5 years ago, diploma in hand, only to have her own parents treat that achievement like a receipt for the most expensive mistake they'd ever made. The truth is, watching them sit in stunned silence wasn't just satisfying because of the money or the power dynamic reversal. It was satisfying because it proved that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards, and sometimes the people who love you most can be the most wrong about what you're capable of achieving. My parents had always prided themselves on being practical people. Robert Hartwell, with his traditional finance background and his conservative investment philosophy, genuinely believed that success came through safe, predictable paths. Patricia, with her social work degree that she'd abandoned after marriage to focus on being a proper wife and mother, had somehow convinced herself that any career path different from the conventional ones was destined for failure. They weren't cruel people. They weren't trying to destroy my dreams out of malice. In their minds, they were protecting me from disappointment, steering me away from what they saw as an inevitable dead end. But their protection felt like persecution, and their concern felt like contempt, especially when it continued long after I'd proven them wrong in smaller ways. For 5 years, every family gathering had been an exercise in subtle undermining. Every holiday dinner included pointed questions about my little computer job and suggestions that it wasn't too late to go back to school for something more stable. Every conversation somehow circled back to their disappointment in my choices and their worry about my future. But now, As I stood in their living room holding the deed to their dream home, all of those conversations felt like distant echoes of people who had fundamentally misunderstood everything about the world we were living in. They had been so focused on traditional markers of success that they'd missed the revolution happening right in front of them. The technology sector wasn't just changing, it was rewriting the rules about how wealth gets created, how careers get built, and what constitutes real value in the modern economy. While they were advising me to play it safe, I was learning to surf the wave of innovation that would eventually carry me far beyond their most ambitious dreams for my future. And now, finally, there was no more room for doubt or dismissal. The numbers were too big, the success too undeniable, the evidence too overwhelming. Their daughter, the one whose education they'd considered a waste, had just demonstrated the kind of financial power they'd never even aspired to themselves. This was the moment everything changed between us forever. 5 years earlier, I was Amelia Hartwell, a 22-year-old college graduate standing in the blazing June sun at Riverside University's commencement ceremony, convinced I was about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. My digital arts and media technology degree felt like a golden ticket to a future where creativity and innovation would drive everything I did. I had spent 4 years diving deep into programming languages, user experience design, digital storytelling, and emerging technologies that most people couldn't even pronounce correctly. My professors had been nothing but encouraging. Dr. James Morrison, my senior project advisor, had pulled me aside just weeks before graduation to tell me that my final thesis project, an interactive media platform that could revolutionize how small businesses engage with customers online, was the most innovative work he'd seen in 15 years of teaching. "You're going to change the world, Amelia," he had said with genuine conviction. "This technology you've developed is at least 3 years ahead of anything the major corporations are working on." I believed him completely. Why wouldn't I? My grades had been exceptional throughout college. I'd won the Dean's Award for Technical Innovation 2 years running, and I'd already had 3 different startups reach out to me about potential positions before I'd even walked across the graduation stage. The future felt limitless, bright, and entirely within my control. My parents had attended the ceremony, of course. They sat in the family section wearing their best clothes and polite smiles, applauding when my name was called just like every other proud parent in that stadium. But I should have noticed the subtle signs even then, the way my father checked his watch repeatedly during the ceremony, the way my mother's smile never quite reached her eyes when she hugged me afterward, the slightly forced enthusiasm in their congratulations. "We're proud of you, sweetheart," my mother had said, adjusting the graduation cap on my head for what felt like the 100th photo. "For years of hard work, and look what you've accomplished." But even as she spoke the words, there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't entirely sure what I had actually accomplished, or whether it was worth celebrating. My father, Robert, had been more direct in his own subtle way. "So what's next, kiddo?" he'd asked while we waited for our table at the graduation dinner he'd insisted on hosting at Willowbrook's most expensive restaurant. "Have you given any thought to graduate school? Maybe something in business administration? It's never too late to add some practical skills to that creative foundation you've built." At the time, I'd brushed off his suggestion with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was headed. "Actually, Dad, I've got 3 job offers already. 2 from startups in the city, and 1 from a consulting firm that specializes in helping established companies transition into digital markets. The technology sector is exploding right now. Companies are desperate for people who understand both the creative and technical sides of digital innovation." I had been so excited to share my prospects with them, so eager to prove that their investment in my education was already paying dividends. I remember pulling out my phone to show them the salary figures from the consulting firm's offer, thinking they'd be impressed by the starting compensation that was significantly higher than what most of my friends were being offered in their more traditional fields. But instead of excitement or pride, I saw something else flash across their faces. Concern, maybe. Or skepticism. My mother exchanged one of those quick, meaningful glances with my father, the kind of wordless communication that comes from 30 years of marriage and shared perspective. "That sounds wonderful, honey," my mother had said carefully, "but you know how volatile these technology companies can be. Remember the dot-com crash? Your father and I lived through that. We saw so many people lose everything when those internet bubbles burst." My father had nodded in agreement, leaning forward with the earnest expression he wore whenever he was about to share what he considered important financial wisdom. "Your mother's right, Amelia. These startup companies, they come and go. They make big promises about revolutionary technology and changing the world, but most of them are gone within 2 years. Wouldn't you feel more secure with something more established? More predictable?" I had tried to explain that the technology sector in 2019 was completely different from the speculative internet bubble of the early 2000s. I'd attempted to describe how digital transformation was becoming essential for every single industry, how companies that didn't adapt would be left behind, how the skills I'd developed weren't just about creating websites or apps but about understanding how technology could solve real business problems in innovative ways. But as I talked, I could see their attention drifting. My father kept glancing at his own phone, probably checking the stock prices of the stable, dividend-paying companies that made up his conservative investment portfolio. My mother smiled and nodded, but in the way people do when they're waiting for you to finish saying something they don't really understand or value. The conversation moved on to other topics: my cousin Derek's new job at a law firm, my high school friend Sarah's acceptance into medical school, my neighbor's son who just started a position at an accounting firm with excellent benefits and a clear path to partnership. These were the kinds of careers my parents understood, the kinds of successes they could easily explain to their friends at dinner parties. My degree, my innovation awards, my job offers from cutting-edge companies, these accomplishments existed in a world they couldn't quite grasp, and what people can't understand, they often can't value. I should have recognized this disconnect then, should have prepared myself for what was coming. But I was still operating under the assumption that results would speak for themselves, that success in my chosen field would eventually translate into the kind of respect and validation every child wants from their parents. I was about to learn how wrong I could be about the people who were supposed to know me best. The move into my first apartment happened 3 weeks later. A modest one-bedroom place in the Riverside district. Nothing fancy but clean and bright with enough space for the home office setup I'd need for remote work. My parents helped me move in, and I remember feeling so optimistic about everything. My new job at TechBridge Solutions was starting the following Monday. My apartment was in a vibrant neighborhood full of young professionals, and my future felt like a blank canvas waiting for me to create something amazing. If only I had known that this optimism was about to be shattered in the most devastating way possible. Our family's relationship with education and success hadn't always been so complicated. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Willowbrook Heights, I was the daughter who consistently brought home straight A's, won science fair competitions, and devoured every computer programming book I could get my hands on. My parents, Robert and Patricia Hartwell, had initially been my biggest cheerleaders, proudly displaying my academic achievements on the refrigerator and bragging to neighbors about their little genius. The story of how I fell in love with technology began when I was just 12 years old. My father had brought home an outdated laptop from his office, a bulky machine that his company was discarding during a technology upgrade. While most kids my age were obsessed with social media and celebrity gossip, I became fascinated with taking the computer apart and figuring out how every component worked together to create something magical. "Look at this, Mom," I had called out excitedly one Saturday morning, having spent the entire night in my bedroom with tiny screwdrivers and instruction manuals I'd printed from the internet. I had successfully upgraded the laptop's memory and installed a new operating system that made it run faster than it ever had originally. My mother had found me surrounded by computer parts, my eyes bright with exhaustion and excitement, holding up the now-functioning machine like a trophy. "That's incredible, sweetheart," Patricia had said, genuinely amazed. "I don't understand how you figured all of that out, but it's absolutely incredible." She had immediately called my father over to see what I'd accomplished, and I'll never forget the pride in his voice when he told his colleagues at work about his daughter who could make computers do whatever she wanted them to do. Back then, my unconventional interests were seen as evidence of exceptional intelligence rather than concerning obsessions. When I spent entire weekends teaching myself programming languages instead of going to sleepovers, my parents viewed it as dedication. When I created a simple inventory management system for my mother's small home-based jewelry business and increased her efficiency by 40%, they saw it as practical application of remarkable skills. The shift began so gradually that none of us noticed it happening. It started during my junior year of high school, when college planning became the dominant topic of every family conversation. My parents had always assumed I would follow a traditional path, perhaps pre-med like my cousin Derek, or business administration like several of my father's successful colleagues. When I announced that I wanted to major in digital arts and media technology, their initial response was supportive but cautious. "That sounds fascinating, honey," my mother had said during one of our college research sessions, "but what exactly would you do with a degree like that? What kind of jobs are available in that field?" She wasn't being dismissive, she was genuinely curious about a career path that didn't exist when she was choosing her major in the 1980s. My father had been more direct in his concerns. "I'm not questioning your abilities, Amelia. You're clearly gifted with technology. But I want to make sure you're thinking practically about your future. How much can someone expect to earn in that field? What does the job market look like? Are there opportunities for advancement and stable benefits?" I had done my research thoroughly. I'd compiled salary data, employment projections, and examples of successful professionals who'd started with degrees similar to the one I was pursuing. The technology sector was experiencing unprecedented growth, and experts predicted that digital literacy would become essential in virtually every industry. Companies were scrambling to find people who could bridge the gap between traditional business practices and emerging technological capabilities. "Dad, look at these numbers," I had said, spreading printouts across our kitchen table like a battle plan. "Entry-level positions for people with my intended degrees start at salaries that are competitive with business majors, and the growth potential is exponential. Plus, I'm not just learning technical skills, I'm learning how to solve complex problems creatively, how to understand user needs, how to communicate effectively across different industries." But even as I presented my case with the thoroughness of a doctoral dissertation, I could sense their underlying skepticism. They listened politely, asked thoughtful questions, and ultimately agreed to support my choice. But there was something in their body language, the way my father drummed his fingers on the table, the way my mother's smile became slightly strained when discussing my future career prospects, that suggested they weren't entirely convinced. The real turning point came during my sophomore year of college, when I started bringing home projects that showcased the kind of work I was learning to do. I had developed a mobile app that helped local restaurants manage their inventory and reduce food waste, a project that had caught the attention of several small business owners in our area. I was so excited to show my parents how my theoretical knowledge was translating into real-world solutions that could help actual businesses operate more efficiently. "This is the app one told you about," I had said, demonstrating how restaurant owners could track their ingredients, predict demand patterns, and automatically generate supply orders. 3 restaurants are already beta testing it, and their food waste has decreased by an average of 25%. One of them wants to pay me to customize it for their specific needs. My father had examined the app politely, clicking through the various features with the careful attention he gave to anything I was passionate about. But when he handed my phone back to me, his comment revealed a fundamental disconnect that would only grow wider over time. "It's very impressive, sweetheart. You clearly put a lot of work into this. But don't you think your time might be better spent on coursework that will prepare you for more substantial career opportunities? This is a nice hobby project, but when you're competing for serious positions after graduation, employers are going to want to see that you focused on the fundamentals of business and leadership." That word, hobby, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a hobby to me. This was my passion, my calling, my vision for how I could contribute something meaningful to the world. The app I'd created wasn't just a school project, it was a demonstration of how technology could solve real problems for real people. But to my father, it was essentially an elaborate video game, something I did for fun rather than something that could form the foundation of a legitimate career. My mother had tried to soften the blow. "What your father means is that we want you to have as many options as possible when you graduate. Maybe you could consider adding a business minor? Or perhaps some economics courses? Just to round out your resume with skills that employers in all industries would recognize and value." I should have recognized this moment as the beginning of a fundamental rift in how we understood success, career value, and the changing nature of the modern economy. But I was still young enough to believe that results would eventually speak louder than preconceptions, that success in my chosen field would ultimately validate my choices in their eyes. I had no idea how wrong I was about their capacity to recognize success when it didn't match their predetermined definitions. The warning signs of my parents' growing disappointment began appearing like cracks in a foundation during my final semester of college. What had started as gentle suggestions about practical career planning evolved into increasingly pointed conversations about my future prospects. I was so focused on excelling in my coursework and preparing for job interviews that I initially missed the subtle but persistent undermining of my confidence that was happening right under my own roof. The first red flag appeared during spring break of my senior year. I had declined a trip to Cabo with my college friends because I'd been invited to present my senior thesis project at the Regional Technology Innovation Conference in downtown Riverside. This was a significant honor. Only 12 students from universities across the entire state had been selected to showcase their work to an audience of industry professionals, potential employers, and venture capitalists. I was beyond excited to share this news with my parents, expecting them to be as thrilled as I was about this recognition of my work. Instead, when I called home to tell them about the invitation, my mother's response was underwhelming to say the least. "That's nice, sweetheart," she had said in the same tone she might use to acknowledge that I'd remembered to take out the trash. "But are you sure it's wise to spend your spring break working instead of relaxing? You've been so stressed lately with all these computer projects. Maybe some time on the beach would be better for your mental health." I had tried to explain that this wasn't work. It was an incredible opportunity to network with potential employers and demonstrate my capabilities to people who actually understood the value of what I was creating. But I could hear the skepticism in her voice when she responded. "I just worry that you're becoming so focused on these technology things that you're missing out on normal college experiences. Your cousin Derek spent his spring break volunteering at a medical clinic in Guatemala. That's the kind of experience that really stands out on applications for graduate school or professional programs." The comparison to Derek stung more than I wanted to admit. Everything I accomplished seemed to be measured against my cousin's achievements in pre-med, and somehow my innovations in technology always came up short in their assessment. Derek's volunteer work was meaningful and impressive, but so was my invitation to present cutting-edge research to industry leaders. The fact that my parents couldn't see the equivalence was becoming increasingly frustrating. The conference itself went spectacularly. My presentation on adaptive user interface design received enthusiastic responses from several tech executives, and I ended up with business cards from 6 different companies that wanted to schedule follow-up interviews. One startup founder even approached me after my presentation to discuss the possibility of building an entire product around the algorithms I'd developed. When I returned home, practically buzzing with excitement about the connections I'd made and the job prospects that were already materializing, I expected my parents to finally understand why I'd been so passionate about my chosen field. Instead, their reaction revealed just how wide the gap had become between my reality and their perception of what constituted real success. "So how was your little technology presentation?" my father asked over dinner, using that same dismissive tone I was beginning to recognize as his default whenever my career aspirations came up in conversation. I noticed he didn't call it a conference, reducing it to a simple presentation, as if I'd just given a book report to my class. I told them about the positive feedback, the job interest, the potential opportunities that were already emerging from this single event. But as I spoke, I watched their expressions remain politely neutral rather than genuinely excited. When I finished describing everything that had happened, my mother's response made it clear that they'd completely missed the significance of what I was sharing. "That all sounds very nice, honey, but I hope you're keeping your options open. These technology companies can be so unpredictable. Maybe you should consider applying to some graduate programs as a backup plan. Your father and I have been talking, and we think a master's in business administration would really round out your resume. Give you some real-world business skills to go along with your computer interests." There was that word again, interests. Not skills, not expertise, not professional capabilities. Just interests, as if my 4 years of intensive study and my growing recognition in the field were equivalent to a casual hobby that I might outgrow given enough time and proper guidance. The conversations became more frequent and more pointed as graduation approached. Every family dinner seemed to include at least one comment about my need to think practically about my future. Every phone call home involved questions about whether I'd considered more stable career options. Every visit included subtle suggestions about graduate school programs that would give me real business credentials. The breaking point came during a family barbecue at our house in early May, just 3 weeks before graduation. Several of my parents' friends were in attendance, along with extended family members who hadn't seen me since the previous summer. I should have been excited to share my accomplishments with people who had watched me grow up, but instead, the evening became an exercise in subtle humiliation. "So Amelia's graduating this month," my mother announced to the gathered group, her voice carrying that particular tone parents use when they're about to share news they're not entirely proud of. "She's been studying computer technology, something with digital media." I watched her struggle to even describe my major accurately, despite having had 4 years to become familiar with the terminology. The way she hesitated over the words made it sound like I'd been pursuing something vague and possibly illegitimate. "Oh, that's interesting," responded Mrs. Henderson from down the street, clearly unsure how to react to this news. "And what kind of job does someone get with a degree like that?" Before I could answer, my father jumped in with his own interpretation of my career prospects. "Well, that's still somewhat unclear. The technology sector is very volatile, you know. Lots of companies that promise big things but don't really have sustainable business models. We're encouraging Amelia to consider some additional education in more traditional business areas. You know, something with a clearer path forward." I felt my face burning with embarrassment as he essentially told a group of family friends that my chosen career path was uncertain and potentially worthless. These were people who had known me since I was a child, who had watched me win academic awards and recognition throughout my school years. Now they were hearing my own father express doubt about whether my college education had been worthwhile. The worst part was watching their faces as they processed this information. I could see them making mental notes, filing away the story of Robert and Patricia Hartwell's daughter who had apparently wasted 4 years studying something impractical. By the end of the evening, I felt like I'd become a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting children pursue unconventional academic paths. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the academic awards and science fair trophies that had once made my parents so proud, I finally understood that something fundamental had changed in our relationship. They weren't just concerned about my future, they were actively embarrassed by my choices. The daughter who had once been their little genius had become their greatest disappointment, and graduation was approaching fast. I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The moment that changed everything happened on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday evening, just 2 weeks after graduation. I had been riding high on the success of landing my dream position at TechBridge Solutions, a rapidly growing consulting firm that specialized in helping traditional businesses integrate cutting-edge digital solutions. My starting salary was higher than what many of my friends with practical degrees were earning, and I had negotiated equity options that could potentially be worth substantial money if the company continued its impressive growth trajectory. I was in my childhood bedroom, packing the last of my belongings before moving into my new apartment the following weekend, when I discovered something that would shatter my perception of my parents' support forever. I had been looking for my old laptop charger in my father's home office when I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on his desk. As I bent down to collect the scattered documents, one particular letter caught my eye, not because of its official letterhead, but because I recognized my own name in the text. It was a letter from Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, the career counseling director at Riverside University, responding to what was apparently a lengthy inquiry my parents had sent her several months earlier. My hands trembled as I read the opening paragraph. "Thank you for reaching out regarding your concerns about Amelia's career trajectory. I understand your worry about the viability of her chosen field and your desire to explore alternative options that might provide more financial security and professional stability." The letter went on for 2 full pages, addressing specific questions my parents had posed about convincing me to change my major, transferring to a different program, or pursuing additional certifications that would make me more employable in traditional business settings. Dr. Yamamoto had responded professionally but firmly, explaining that students who completed our program had excellent employment prospects and that the technology sector offered tremendous opportunities for growth and innovation. But it was the final paragraph that left me feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. "While I appreciate your parental concern, I must emphasize that Amelia is one of our most gifted students. Her senior thesis project has already attracted interest from several major corporations, and her technical abilities are truly exceptional. I would strongly encourage you to trust in her choices and support her passion for this field, as she has the potential to achieve remarkable success in the technology industry." My parents had written to my career counselor. Behind my back, while I was presenting at conferences and earning recognition for my work, while I was building relationships with potential employers and developing innovative solutions to real-world problems, they had been actively trying to undermine my career path. They hadn't just been skeptical, they had been working against me. I sat in that office chair for what felt like hours, reading and rereading that letter, trying to process the betrayal I was feeling. This wasn't casual parental concern or misguided advice. This was a deliberate attempt to sabotage my chosen career while maintaining a facade of support to my face. Every conversation about keeping my options open, every suggestion about graduate school, every comparison to my cousin Derek's more traditional path, it had all been part of a coordinated effort to steer me away from the field where I was already demonstrating exceptional talent. The discovery got worse. As I continued searching through the papers on my father's desk, now intentionally looking for more evidence of their duplicity, I found printed emails between my parents discussing my situation. One email chain from my mother to my father, dated just 3 weeks earlier, contained words that are burned into my memory forever. I spoke with Linda Morrison today about her daughter's experience in the accounting program at State University. She's already been offered a position at a Big Four firm with excellent benefits and a clear advancement structure. Meanwhile, Amelia is moving to that tiny apartment to work for some startup company that probably won't exist in 2 years. I think we need to have a serious conversation with her before she makes a mistake she can't recover from. My father's response was even more devastating. I agree completely. We've invested $60,000 in her education, and this is what we have to show for it. A job at a company no one's ever heard of, working on projects that seem more like elaborate video games than real business solutions. Maybe it's time to be more direct about our concerns. She's always been stubborn, but surely she'll listen to reason if we explain the financial realities clearly enough. There it was, in black and white. My parents didn't just doubt my career choice, they considered their investment in my education to be a complete waste of money. The degree I had earned with distinction, the recognition I had received from professors and industry professionals, the job offers that had validated everything I'd worked toward, none of it mattered to them because it didn't fit their narrow definition of legitimate success. I found more evidence of their behind-the-scenes campaign. Phone numbers for local graduate programs circled in red ink. Printed job listings for entry-level positions in accounting, marketing, and business administration, fields they considered more appropriate for their daughter. Even a highlighted newspaper article about the instability of technology startups that my mother had apparently saved to use as ammunition in future arguments about my career prospects. The most painful discovery was a notebook my mother had been keeping, tracking what she called my poor decisions over the past year. She had documented every time I'd chosen to work on projects instead of attending social events, every job interview with a technology company, every conversation where I'd expressed enthusiasm about my field. Next to each entry, she'd written little notes like, becoming too isolated, and losing perspective on practical careers, and needs intervention. The intervention, I realized, was what they'd been planning all along. The graduation dinner they'd insisted on hosting wasn't meant to be a celebration. It was going to be an ambush where they finally told me exactly what they thought of my choices and demanded that I reconsider my entire future. But they never got the chance to spring their trap, because I found their evidence first. As I sat in that office, surrounded by the documentation of their disapproval and their secret efforts to redirect my life, I felt something inside me shift permanently. This wasn't just a disagreement about career paths or a generational misunderstanding about the technology industry. This was a fundamental rejection of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The parents who had once proudly called me their little genius had become my biggest obstacles, working actively behind the scenes to sabotage the very success they claimed to want for me. They had taken my trust, my love, my respect for their opinions, and used all of it against me while pretending to be supportive. I carefully returned all the papers to their original positions, making sure nothing looked disturbed. But inside, everything had changed. I was no longer their daughter who sought their approval and validation. I was no longer the young woman who second-guessed her choices when faced with their skepticism. I was someone who now understood exactly what I was up against, and exactly what I needed to prove. The real confrontation was still ahead of me, but the war had already begun the moment I discovered those papers. My parents had made their position clear. they considered their investment in my education to be money wasted on a worthless degree that would lead to an unstable career. They were about to learn just how wrong they were about everything. The confrontation I had been unconsciously dreading finally arrived 3 days later, exactly as I had predicted after discovering their secret correspondence. My parents had invited me to what they called a celebration dinner at Meridian's, the upscale steakhouse where our family had traditionally marked important milestones. But I knew better now. This wasn't a celebration, this was their carefully planned intervention, the moment they intended to reveal their true feelings about my career choices and demand that I abandon everything I'd worked toward. I arrived at the restaurant armed with knowledge they didn't know I possessed, carrying copies of their emails and Dr. Yamamoto's letter in my purse like evidence in a criminal trial. My heart was pounding as I walked through the elegant dining room, past tables of families actually celebrating their children's achievements, toward the corner booth where my parents sat waiting with expressions that were meant to look supportive but struck me as predatory. "There's our college graduate," my father announced with forced enthusiasm as I approached the table, loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "Come sit down, sweetheart. We have so much to discuss about your future." The way he emphasized the word future made it clear that my present circumstances weren't going to be part of that conversation. I slid into the booth opposite them, noting how they had positioned themselves side by side like a united front preparing for battle. The congratulatory facade lasted exactly as long as it took for our server to take our drink orders. "So, Amelia," my mother began, her voice taking on that artificially gentle tone she used when she was about to deliver news she knew I wouldn't want to hear. "Your father and I have been doing some research, and we've discovered some concerning information about the technology industry that we think you should know about." I almost laughed at the setup. After months of secretly investigating ways to undermine my career choice, they were presenting their ambush as if they'd stumbled upon this information accidentally and were sharing it out of purely altruistic concern for my well-being. "What kind of information?" I asked, deciding to let them present their case fully before revealing what I knew about their behind-the-scenes activities. My father leaned forward, pulling out a folder that I recognized from his desk, the same folder where I'd found their damning correspondence. "We've been looking at employment statistics for recent graduates in technology-related fields, and the numbers are quite troubling. Did you know that over 40% of technology startups fail within their first 2 years? And that's not even accounting for the massive layoffs that happen regularly in this industry." He spoke with the confidence of someone presenting irrefutable facts, completely unaware that I had already seen the newspaper clippings and biased articles he'd collected to support his predetermined conclusion. These weren't objective statistics, they were carefully selected pieces of information designed to paint the bleakest possible picture of my chosen field. "That's interesting," I replied calmly. "Did your research also mention that the technology sector has created more millionaires under the age of 30 than any other industry in the past decade? Or that digital transformation is considered essential for virtually every major corporation in America?" My mother exchanged that familiar glance with my father, the same look I'd observed countless times when they thought I was being naive or unrealistic. "Sweetheart, we understand that there are some success stories, but those are exceptions rather than the rule. The reality is that most people in your field end up struggling financially, jumping from one unstable position to another." The condescension in her voice was so thick I could practically taste it. Here I was, a recent graduate who had already secured a well-paying position with equity options at a growing company, being lectured about financial instability by parents whose own investment portfolio had barely outpaced inflation over the past decade. "Which brings us to our proposal," my father continued, opening his folder to reveal printed applications for various graduate programs. "We've taken the liberty of researching some excellent MBA programs that would complement your technical background with real business skills. Programs that would position you for management roles in established companies rather than these risky startup ventures." There it was, the culmination of their secret campaign. They had researched graduate programs without my knowledge, prepared applications without my consent, and were now presenting this as a reasonable next step in my education. The presumption was breathtaking. "You took the liberty?" I repeated, my voice remaining steady despite the anger building inside me. "You researched graduate programs for me without asking what I wanted?" "We're your parents, Amelia," my mother said, her tone becoming slightly sharper as she sensed resistance to their plan. "It's our job to guide you away from decisions that could harm your future prospects. You're 22 years old. You don't have enough life experience to fully understand the risks you're taking. That was the moment I decided to drop my own bombshell. I reached into my purse and pulled out the copies of their correspondence, placing them on the table between us like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. You mean risks like writing to my career counselor behind my back to discuss ways to convince me to change my major? I asked, watching their faces drain of color as they recognized their own words staring back at them. Or risks like documenting my poor decisions in a notebook? Or maybe risks like telling your friends that my degree is essentially worthless? The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced with my parents. My father's mouth actually fell open as he stared at the papers, while my mother's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of shock that would have been comical if the situation weren't so devastating. Amelia, how did you? My father began, then stopped, realizing that the question revealed his guilt rather than disputing the accusation. How did I find out that you've been working against me for months while pretending to be supportive? I finished his question. Does it matter how I found out? What matters is that you did it. What matters is that while I was working to make you proud, you were actively trying to sabotage my success. My mother recovered first, her shock quickly transforming into defensive anger. We weren't sabotaging anything. We were trying to prevent you from making a massive mistake with your life. Do you have any idea how much money we've invested in your education? $60,000, Amelia. $60,000 for a degree that's going to leave you working for companies that don't even have proven business models. There it was, the truth I had been dreading but somehow expecting. After everything I had accomplished, after all the recognition and opportunities that had validated my choices, my parents still considered their investment in my education to be money wasted. So that's what this is really about, I said, my voice growing colder with each word. You're not concerned about my happiness or my potential for success. You're upset that your investment didn't pay off in the way you expected. You wanted me to pursue a career that would reflect well on you, not necessarily one that would fulfill me. That's not fair, my father protested, but his tone lacked conviction. We want you to be successful and secure. These technology jobs, they're not real careers, Amelia. They're experiments. They're hobbies that people get paid for temporarily until the market corrects itself. The dismissiveness in his voice when he said hobbies was the final straw. I looked at these two people who had raised me, who had once been proud of my unconventional abilities, who had celebrated my academic achievements, and I realized that somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing me as their daughter and started seeing me as their failed investment. I have a real career, I said firmly, gathering the papers and putting them back in my purse. I have a position at a respected company, equity options that could be worth substantial money, and colleagues who value my contributions. What I don't have anymore is parents who believe in me. I stood up from the table, leaving my untouched menu and their shocked expressions behind. When you're ready to apologize for trying to undermine my success and support the choices I've made, you know where to find me. Until then, I think we need some distance. As I walked away from that table, I heard my mother call my name, but I didn't turn around. The relationship I had cherished my entire life was over, ended not by my choice but by their inability to see past their own narrow definitions of success and security. I had no idea that this confrontation would be the catalyst for everything that followed, the determination, the success, and ultimately, the justice that would bring us full circle years later. The weeks following that devastating dinner at Meridian's were the loneliest of my entire life. I had expected cutting ties with my parents to feel liberating, but instead, it felt like losing a fundamental part of my identity. For 22 years, their approval had been my North Star, their expectations the framework within which I understood my own worth. Now, suddenly, I was navigating the world without that compass, and the disorientation was overwhelming. My small apartment in the Riverside district, which had once felt like a symbol of independence and new beginnings, now seemed like evidence of everything my parents had warned me about. The modest furnishings I'd been proud to afford on my own suddenly looked shabby compared to the elegant home I'd grown up in. The excitement I'd felt about starting my career at TechBridge Solutions was dampened by the constant echo of my father's voice calling my work hobbies and experiments. For the first time since accepting the position, I found myself questioning whether my parents might have been right about the instability of the technology sector. Every day brought news of another startup folding, another round of layoffs at established tech companies, another cautionary tale about the volatility of the industry I'd chosen to stake my future on. The confidence I'd built over 4 years of academic success began to crumble under the weight of their systematic demolition of my self-belief. The isolation was the hardest part. I had always been close to my family, and holidays and weekends had typically involved long phone calls home or visits to Willowbrook Heights. Now, my phone remained silent. My weekends stretched endlessly with no family obligations to anchor them. I found myself checking my email obsessively, hoping for some sign that my parents regretted their ultimatum and were ready to apologize for their betrayal. 3 months into this estrangement, just as I was beginning to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake by walking away from their dinner table, I received a call that would change everything. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was warmly familiar. Amelia? This is Margaret Chen, Dr. Morrison's research assistant from Riverside University. I hope I'm not calling it a bad time. Margaret had been the graduate student who had helped supervise my senior thesis project, and we developed a friendly working relationship during those intense final months of college. I was surprised to hear from her, but pleased to connect with someone from my academic world during this period of professional and personal uncertainty. Margaret. It's so good to hear from you. How are things at the university? Actually, that's why I'm calling. Dr. Morrison and I have been following your work at TechBridge Solutions, and we've been incredibly impressed with what you've accomplished since graduation. But more importantly, we've been discussing something that we think might interest you. I felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with apprehension. What kind of something? Well, you remember that adaptive user interface algorithm you developed for your senior thesis? The one that caught so much attention at the Regional Technology Conference? How could I forget? That algorithm had been the culmination of everything I'd learned during my 4 years of study, a piece of innovative coding that had earned me recognition from professors and industry professionals alike. It was also the project my parents had dismissed as an elaborate video game. Of course I remember. What about it? Margaret's voice carried barely contained excitement as she continued. Dr. Morrison has been in contact with several venture capital firms that specialize in emerging technologies. Apparently, the work you did has been circulating in some very influential circles, and there's serious interest in seeing it developed into a commercial product. My heart started beating faster. What kind of interest? The kind that comes with significant funding and the opportunity to build your own company around your innovations. Amelia, we're talking about the possibility of you becoming the founder and CEO of a startup that could revolutionize how businesses interact with their customers online. I sat down heavily in my tiny living room, trying to process what Margaret was telling me. Just 3 months ago, I had been defending my career choice to parents who considered it worthless. Now, I was being told that the work they had dismissed could potentially become the foundation for my own company. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm just a recent graduate working at a consulting firm. I don't have any business experience. I wouldn't even know where to begin with something like that. Margaret laughed gently. That's exactly what Dr. Morrison said you'd say. He wanted me to remind you of something he told you during your thesis defense. The most revolutionary innovations come from people who are brave enough to challenge conventional thinking. Amelia, you've already done the hard part. You've created something genuinely innovative. The rest is just execution. She went on to explain that Dr. Morrison had been quietly advocating for my work in academic and business circles, sharing my research with contacts who specialized in identifying promising new technologies. One of those contacts, a venture capital firm called Catalyst Partners, had expressed serious interest in meeting with me to discuss the commercial potential of my algorithms. They're looking for exactly what you've created, Margaret continued. A technology solution that can adapt in real time to user behavior, that can personalize digital experiences in ways that current systems simply can't match. The applications are endless: e-commerce, digital marketing, educational platforms, entertainment streaming. You haven't just created a product, Amelia. You've created a platform that could transform multiple industries. As she spoke, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, genuine excitement about my professional future. The depression and self-doubt that had been weighing me down began to lift as I remembered why I had fallen in love with technology in the first place. It wasn't about proving my parents wrong or validating my degree. It was about the pure joy of creating solutions to complex problems, of using innovation to make people's lives better. "There's something else," Margaret said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Dr. Morrison wanted me to tell you that he's been keeping track of the other students from your graduating class. Do you know how many of them are already working for companies that want to license or acquire technologies like yours? How many of them are being recruited by major corporations specifically because of the innovative thinking your program taught them?" I didn't know, but I was beginning to understand that my parents' dire predictions about my field had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. While they had been worried about my job security, the entire industry had been evolving in directions that made my skills increasingly valuable. "Margaret," I said, my voice stronger now than it had been in months, "tell Dr. Morrison I'm interested. Tell him I want to hear what Catalyst Partners has to say." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the most valuable lesson I'd learned hadn't come from any textbook or lecture hall. It had come from my grandmother, who had passed away when I was 16 but whose words had shaped my approach to life ever since. "Never let other people's limitations become your ceiling, sweetheart. Sometimes the people who love you most will be the ones who understand you least." My parents had tried to impose their limitations on my dreams, but their betrayal had inadvertently freed me to pursue possibilities they couldn't even imagine. The daughter they had written off as a poor investment was about to become an entrepreneur, and the education they had considered worthless was about to become the foundation for something extraordinary. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call from Margaret was the first step toward building not just a successful company, but the kind of transformative success that would eventually allow me to purchase their dream home with the profits from the career they had tried so hard to prevent me from pursuing. The meeting with Catalyst Partners took place on a crisp October morning in their downtown Riverside offices, and I remember every detail with crystal clarity. Walking into that glass-walled conference room, looking out at the city skyline while three venture capitalists examined my algorithms and business projections, I felt like I was stepping into a completely different version of my life, one where my parents' doubts seemed not just wrong, but laughably irrelevant. Daniel Rodriguez, the managing partner, had opened the presentation by saying something that still gives me chills. "Ms. Hartwell, in 15 years of evaluating technology startups, I've rarely seen innovation this elegant combined with market potential this vast. Your adaptive interface algorithms don't just solve current problems, they anticipate needs that most companies don't even realize they have yet." 6 weeks later, I signed the funding agreement that would transform my senior thesis project into Cloud Vision Interactive, a company focused on revolutionary customer experience technology. The initial investment of $2.8 million felt surreal, more money than my parents had ever dreamed of accumulating in their traditional investment portfolio, and it was being entrusted to their daughter whose education they had considered a waste. But building a successful company from a promising algorithm proved to be far more challenging than I had anticipated. The first year was a blur of 18-hour workdays, endless coding sessions, and the kind of problem-solving that required every skill I had developed during my supposedly worthless college years. I assembled a team of brilliant developers and designers, each of whom shared my vision for how technology could create more intuitive, personalized digital experiences. Meanwhile, my parents were experiencing their own trajectory, one that validated their conventional wisdom in the short term while setting them up for a spectacular reversal later. My father had been promoted to senior vice president at his investment firm, a position that came with a substantial salary increase and the kind of prestige he valued above almost everything else. They had used this financial boost to purchase their dream retirement home in Willowbrook Hills, a stunning 4,200 square foot estate with imported marble floors and custom fixtures that became the centerpiece of their social identity. I knew about their new house because word traveled quickly through our shared social circles, but we hadn't spoken directly since that disastrous dinner at Meridian's. Mutual friends would occasionally update me on their activities, how they had become active members of the Willowbrook Country Club, how my mother had joined the board of the local historical society, how they seemed to be living exactly the kind of comfortable, traditional success story they had always envisioned for themselves. What these friends didn't know was that my parents had apparently crafted a narrative about my absence from family events that painted me as the stubborn daughter who had chosen her pride over family relationships. According to several sources, they told people I was going through a difficult phase, and that they were giving me space to figure things out, while hoping I would eventually come to my senses about practical career planning. The irony was devastating. While they were telling their country club friends about their wayward daughter who needed to learn life lessons, that same daughter was revolutionizing how major corporations approached customer engagement. CloudVision Interactive's first major client was Pinnacle Retail Group, a chain of department stores that wanted to personalize their online shopping experience using our adaptive algorithms. The success of that implementation led to contracts with 3 more major retailers, then a breakthrough partnership with Meridian Entertainment that transformed how streaming platforms recommend content to users. Each success felt like vindication, but also like validation of something deeper than professional achievement. Every time a client praised our innovative approach, every time an industry publication featured our work, every time a competitor tried to replicate our technology, I remembered sitting in that restaurant listening to my parents dismiss my field as unstable and impractical. The real breakthrough came in year 3, when Global Tech Consortium, one of the largest technology companies in the world, approached us about acquiring our platform technology. But instead of simply buying our algorithms, they proposed something unprecedented. A full acquisition of CloudVision Interactive that would make me the youngest chief technology officer in their corporate history, while allowing me to maintain operational control over my innovations. The negotiation process took 6 months and involved the kind of financial figures that seemed abstract until they appeared in legal documents with my signature. The final acquisition price was $847 million, with my personal stake valued at just over $380 million. Suddenly, the daughter whose education had cost $60,000 and been deemed worthless was worth more than $500 million. But perhaps more importantly than the money was the recognition that came with the acquisition. Harvard Business Review featured me on their cover as an example of Generation Z entrepreneurs who are reshaping entire industries. The Technology Innovation Institute invited me to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference, the same organization that had recognized my work as a college student. Forbes included me in their 30 Under 30 list, with a profile that detailed how my algorithms were being implemented by companies serving over 200 million customers worldwide. During this period of incredible professional growth, would occasionally receive updates about my parents through our shared network of family friends. They seemed to be thriving in their own conventional way. My father had been mentioned in the business section of the local newspaper for his role in several successful investment deals, while my mother had been featured in Willowbrook Society pages for her charitable work with the Historical Society. What they didn't know, because we still weren't speaking, was that their daughter had become one of the most successful technology entrepreneurs of her generation. They had no idea that the algorithms they had dismissed as elaborate video games were now powering digital experiences for some of the largest companies in the world. They were completely unaware that the career they had tried to sabotage had generated more wealth than they could accumulate in 10 lifetimes of traditional business success. The moment when our parallel trajectories would finally intersect was approaching rapidly, though neither they nor I could have predicted the circumstances that would bring us face to face. I had been focused on building something meaningful, proving my capabilities to myself and the world. I hadn't been plotting revenge or planning dramatic confrontations. But the universe, it seems, has its own sense of justice. When I learned through our family lawyer that my parents were being forced to sell their Willowbrook Hills estate due to unexpected financial pressures, my father's investment firm had been caught in a major scandal involving fraudulent client portfolios, I didn't initially see it as an opportunity for vindication. I saw it as a chance to finally demonstrate that success isn't about proving others wrong, but about building something lasting and meaningful. The house they were losing wasn't just their dream home. It was the symbol of everything they valued: traditional prestige, conventional success, the kind of stability they had always insisted I should prioritize over innovation and risk-taking. And now their daughter, the one whose education they had considered a waste of money, was in a position to purchase that symbol with the profits from the career they had tried to prevent her from pursuing. The circle was about to close in the most poetic way imaginable. The purchase of my parents' Willowbrook Hills estate happened with a swiftness that surprised even me. When their financial crisis became public knowledge, my father's investment firm had been implicated in a massive Ponzi scheme that destroyed the retirement savings of hundreds of clients. They were forced to list their dream home at a significant discount to generate quick liquidity for legal fees and potential restitution payments. I learned about the listing not through any vindictive monitoring of their situation, but through my real estate investment advisor, who had been searching for properties that could serve as the headquarters for Cloud Vision Interactive's expanding operations. The irony that my parents' house appeared on his list of available luxury properties was so perfect it felt like the universe orchestrating its own sense of justice. "This Willowbrook estate has everything you specified," Marcus Wellington, my advisor, had explained during our meeting. "Enough space for executive offices, proximity to the tech corridor, and the kind of prestigious address that impresses international clients. The owners are motivated sellers, so we could likely secure it below market value." I had stared at the listing photos, recognizing every custom detail my parents had proudly showcased during their housewarming party 4 years earlier. The imported marble floors, the soaring ceilings, the chandeliers they had selected during multiple trips to European design houses, all of it now available for purchase by the daughter whose career they had dismissed as worthless. The cash offer I submitted was 30% above their asking price, not because I needed to outbid competitors, but because I wanted to ensure my parents could walk away from their crisis with some dignity intact. When my attorney called to confirm that the offer had been accepted, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness that I'm still trying to fully understand. The closing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, and I had decided to handle the final walkthrough personally rather than sending representatives. I wanted to see my parents' faces when they realized who had purchased their home, but more importantly, I needed to understand whether the years of estrangement had changed any of us enough to rebuild some kind of relationship. I arrived at the house 20 minutes before the scheduled appointment, parking my Tesla Model S in the circular driveway where I had once helped unload groceries during family visits. The house looked exactly as I remembered it, but somehow smaller, either because my own circumstances had expanded so dramatically, or because the fear and uncertainty my parents were experiencing had diminished the power this symbol of success once held. When the front door opened, my mother appeared first, looking older and more fragile than I had expected. For years of estrangement and recent financial stress had taken a visible toll, adding lines around her eyes and a hesitancy to her movements that I had never seen before. Behind her, my father emerged from the foyer, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to complete shock as he recognized his daughter standing on his doorstep. "Amelia," my mother whispered, her hand flying to her throat in that familiar gesture of surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here for the final walkthrough," I replied calmly, pulling the purchase agreement from my briefcase. "I'm your buyer." The silence that followed was more profound than anything we had experienced during our confrontation at Meridian's 4 years earlier. This wasn't anger or disappointment, this was pure cognitive dissonance as they tried to process how their daughter, whose career they had considered unstable and unprofitable, had acquired the financial resources to purchase their $1 million home with a cash offer. My father was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "You bought our house? But how could you possibly? I mean, your job at that startup company. You mean Cloud Vision Interactive?" I replied, enjoying the way his eyes widened as he recognized the company name from recent business headlines. "The startup that was acquired by Global Tech Consortium for $847 million? The same company where I now serve as Chief Technology Officer while maintaining a controlling interest in the intellectual property?" I watched my mother's legs buckle slightly, and she reached for the doorframe to steady herself. "But that's impossible. You were working with computers and applications. Those aren't real businesses. They don't generate serious money." The statement was so perfectly representative of everything they had failed to understand about the modern economy that I almost smiled. Here they were, losing their dream home because my father's traditional investment strategies had involved him with criminal activity, while their daughter's fake career had generated enough wealth to rescue them from their crisis. "Would you like to see the purchase agreement?" I asked, offering them the document that detailed the all-cash transaction. "Or perhaps you prefer to discuss the algorithms that made this possible? The same algorithms I developed during my senior thesis, the project you dismissed as elaborate video games?" My father took the papers with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the financial figures that represented more money than he had earned in his entire career. When he looked up at me, his expression had transformed from shock to something approaching awe. "I don't understand how this happened," he said quietly. "We were so certain that your choices were going to lead to financial instability. Everything we knew about successful careers suggested that technology was too risky, too volatile. Everything you knew was based on outdated models, I replied, but without the anger I might have felt years earlier. The world changed while you were trying to protect me from it. The skills you considered worthless became the foundation for entire industries. My mother finally found her voice, though it was barely audible. We were wrong, weren't we? About everything. The admission hung in the air between us, and I realized that this moment wasn't about vindication or revenge. It was about the possibility of rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged by misunderstanding and fear. You weren't wrong about wanting me to be successful and secure, I said gently. You were just wrong about what success and security look like in the 21st century. But that's understandable. You were trying to guide me based on the world you knew, not the world I was entering. Over the following hour, as we completed the formal walkthrough of what was now my property, I explained how my career had developed, how the technology I'd created was being used by companies worldwide, and how the financial success they were witnessing was just the beginning of what I hoped to accomplish. More importantly, I told them about my plans for the house. Cloud Vision Interactive did need expanded office space, but I also wanted to create something meaningful for our community, a technology education center where young people could learn the skills that would define their generation's economy. I'd like you to consider staying involved, I said as we stood in the living room where they had once entertained their country club friends. Not as owners, but as advisors. Your experience with traditional business practices, combined with my understanding of emerging technologies, could create something really powerful. The conversation that followed wasn't a complete reconciliation. Too much had happened for that to be possible in a single afternoon. But it was a beginning, a recognition that we had all learned important lessons during our years of separation. As I drove away from the house that evening, leaving my parents to pack their belongings while processing the reality that their daughter had become their financial rescuer, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The woman who had once desperately sought their approval had evolved into someone who no longer needed external validation to understand her own worth. The education they had considered a waste of money had indeed been the best investment any of us had ever made, not because it generated financial returns, but because it taught me to think differently, to solve problems creatively, and to build something meaningful that could benefit others. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply becoming everything you were capable of being, regardless of who believed in you along the way. And if this story of family reconciliation and professional vindication inspired you, you absolutely need to watch tomorrow's video about the student who was told she'd never amount to anything and ended up buying the entire school district. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because these transformation stories just keep getting more incredible. What's the biggest dream someone told you was impossible? Drop it in the comments below, because being too ambitious might just be your greatest strength. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.